okay? Talking about isosceles triangles. So that's when you have two sides of your triangle congruent to each other. Okay? Two sides of your triangle congruent to each other. So we are going to label the different parts of this isosceles triangle. The legs of an isosceles triangle are the two congruent sides. Okay, so one leg would be segment AC. The other leg then would be segment BC. Okay, so your legs are those congruent sides. The vertex of an isosceles triangle is the angle between your two congruent sides. Okay, so the angle between these two congruent sides here is angle C. Okay, so that would have to be your vertex. Okay, then you also have base angles. Your base angles are the other two angles in that triangle. Okay, so in this case, I could say this is angle 1 and angle 2. Or if you use the letters, it would be angle A and angle B. Okay, so those are your base angles. So we do have an isosceles triangle theorem that states if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are also congruent. Okay, so here, if I have my two sides congruent to each other, okay, then the angles opposite those. Okay, so again, I have my sides congruent. The angle opposite that side and opposite this side would also be congruent. Okay, so those are your base angles. So your base angles in isosceles triangles are congruent. Now we can also take the converse of that. So that's the backwards statement. That says if two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite those angles are also congruent. So now this time, you're starting with the angles. Okay, so if we know the base angles are congruent to each other, then the sides opposite those angles, so this side across and this side across, would be congruent to each other. Okay, so it's just the opposite of that first one. So we're going to use those to mark our congruent sides and angles in these triangles here. So number 1, let's say I'm given these two sides are congruent. On your paper, label the two angles that would be congruent. Label the two angles that would be congruent. Okay, you should have these two angles here labeled as congruent. Okay, so this angle is opposite that side, and this angle is opposite that side. Now, number 2, let's do the opposite. So if I have these two angles labeled as congruent, label your congruent sides. Okay, label the sides that have to be congruent, given those two angles are. Okay, you should have these two sides labeled. So again, across from that angle, across from this angle. Last one, we'll do sides again. So if these two sides are congruent, label the angles that must be congruent. Okay, so these two angles should be labeled as congruent in your triangle. So questions on those? All right, then we're going to do some examples using this isosceles triangle theorem. So in number 4, we want to find the measure of angle B. Okay, so in my triangle here, I have segment AB congruent to segment AC. Well, don't I know those opposite angles have to be congruent, right? If I have congruent sides. So this side, or this angle here, and this angle here must be congruent to each other. Well, if those are congruent, what's the measure of angle B? 60. Good. Okay, another example, number 5. We want to find the measure of angle D. So that's this one right here. Well, again, I have my markers to show those sides are congruent. So I'm going to look at the angles that would be congruent. So those are opposite angles. So mark those as congruent. Now, what I can do here, I know all 3 of these angles have to add to what? 180, right? So I can take 180 and subtract the angle I know, which is 40, to get 140. Now that 140 has to be split between these 2 congruent angles. So what should I do? Divide by 2. Okay, so we get the measure of angle D then is 70 degrees. Questions so far? Okay, then let's look at number 6. In number 6, this time we have to find the length of the side. So we're looking for this side AC. Well, in my picture here, I notice that these 2 angles are labeled as congruent. So that means those opposite sides also have to be congruent. Okay, meaning AC would have to equal 4. Questions on that one? All right, we're going to do some more examples. We're going to solve for the value of x in these ones. So in number 7, again, you're looking at these pictures. I have 2 sides marked as congruent. I need to identify the angles that would be congruent. Okay, so the angles opposite those sides are congruent to each other. So if angle Q is 2x, angle R is also 2x. Okay? Now I know that all 3 of these angles have to add to be 180. So I can set up an equation of 40 plus 2x plus 2x and set it equal to 180. So when you do this, you always have to include all 3 angles. Okay, all 3 angles have to add to be 180. And from here, I would just solve for x. So I have 40 plus 4x equals 180. Subtract 40 from both sides of your equation. You get 4x is equal to 140. Okay, and then divide both sides by 4. To get x is 35. Questions on that one? Okay, number 8 is using the converse. Okay, so I have my 2 angles labeled as congruent. So those opposite sides must also be congruent. Okay, if those sides are congruent, that means those measures are equal to each other. So I can set 2x plus 6 equal to 3x minus 6. Because I know those sides are congruent, so their measures must also be. And from here, I would then just solve for x. So subtract 2x and add 6. To get x is 12. Okay, questions on 8. All right, do problem number 9. Problem number 9. It's similar to number 7. Okay, do problem number 9. I'm going to do one more and then I'll let you do your homework. Huh?
Okay, so I already done.
Which one? I'm going to do number 11.
So what exactly? We tried to write.
All right, let's come back together so we can go over number 9. So in number 9, you have this side WY congruent to WZ. So that means the angles opposite those sides are congruent to each other. Shh, quiet now. So angle Y is 3x and angle Z is 3x. Okay, and I know all three of these angles do have to add to 180. So I can take 3x plus 90 equals 180. Don't forget that 90-degree angle. You have to have all three angles together to be 180. Okay, so then I have 6x plus 90 is 180. Subtract 90 to get 6x equals 90. And divide by 6 to get x is 15. Okay, questions on number 9. Did you all get 15? Yeah? Okay, let's do number 11. Okay, number 11 is very similar to number 9. Okay, so in number 11, your given side AB is congruent to BC. Okay, so I'm looking for the angles across from those sides to be congruent. So if angle A is 6x plus 6, what is angle C? Okay, and again, I have all three angles can add together to be what? 180. Okay, so I have 6x plus 6 plus 6x plus 6 plus 2x, don't forget that third angle, is equal to 180. Okay, so I can combine like terms on the left-hand side. So I have 6x plus 6x plus 2x. That's 14x. And then 6 plus 6 is 12. That's equal to 180. Subtract 12 from both sides. And divide by 14. X is 12. Okay, how do we feel about isosceles triangles?
Very good.